Hey, here we go. Well, welcome. I'm Colleen Benelli. I'm here with Robin. Hi,
Hello.
Robin.
Hi.
And we are super excited to be here today with Micah Schwader. I have known Micah for, 20 years at least, something like that.
24.
And yeah, and Micah is here from Costa Rica. And so we have this opportunity now to be able to have global conversations. And actually, I've lost touch with him. And so I'm super excited to just catch up in addition to the subject that we are talking about today and all that he has to share. So, anyway, I am going to say hello to you to begin with. Hi, Micah.
Hi there. Glad to be here. Very
And
excited.
I'm going to go ahead and read his bio, and we'll go from there and start with his story and get right into it. So, approaching his 51st trip around the sun, Micah, formerly Marilyn, had a profound realization. He was, in truth, a man in a woman's body. In that moment, he saw much of his lifelong spiritual search for purpose had been about uncovering and aligning with his true gender. As Micah embraced his authentic self, he embarked on a wild ride of self discovery. Transitioning from Marilyn to Micah wasn't just a change in name, it was a journey to reclaim his true identity amidst a cacophony of internal doubts and external forces wishing to deny his lived experience. In the face of the turbulence, he found an oasis of inner peace after discovering and studying the ancient principles of shamanism. Having been a transformational writing coach for 30 years, helping authors publish and promote their spiritual and transformational books, Micah knows that sharing his story will help others see their truth, no matter who they are or how they appear in the world. Micah is bringing his journey to the world in his memoir, Stumbling into Grace, The Adventures of a Transgender Shaman. So good, Micah. In it, he shares how encounters with shamanism and a tapestry of extraordinary events and ordinary people shaped his journey toward embracing the divine essence within. His website is micahschwader.com, and that is Micah. Schwader is SCHWADER.com. Of course, this will also be in our show notes, but for those of you listening, micahschwader.com. So, Micah, I think what we'd like to do is just start with your story. So I met Micah a long time ago in the Light Song School of Shamanic Studies in our Light Song community. So we studied shamanism together, and so we've known each other a long time. So
been
go
through
ahead and share your story.
been through a lot, actually. I think we've done 5 vision quests together.
Yes.
I mean, I did about 20 vision quests sport camps, but there were 5 of those that I was actually on the hill doing the vision quests with as you were assisting Jan. So yeah, we've been through a lot. A lot of
Yes, we
sweat
have.
lodges, fire walks, a bunch of stuff. So it's been great. And that's been really a help. I actually started studying shamanism way before I had the realization of being transgender.
Yeah.
So I started studying shamanism in, I think it was 2001. And it wasn't until 2011 that I discovered or realized that I'm transgender. So it was great because the shamanism really, well, not just shamanism, but Jan's focus in shamanism was often about finding the true self. So there was already a search for that. Although I do have to say a lot of my spiritual journey was looking on the exterior. I was looking for what was out there that was going to fill that void that wasn't being filled internally. So, and I think that's a lot of people's spiritual journey is, but that's, ultimately that's a separation from self when you're looking for it outside yourself. So Jan's teaching was finding your true self, your true essence. And then the shamanic work, bringing in the dimensionality, the quantum physics of shamanism, the how are we creating our own reality? What are we doing with our lives? That kind of thing also came in. And it was, when I started writing my memoir, it was actually before my transgender realization. So I was actually writing about shamanism even before I started so the book is actually a kind of a before after. There's all of the stuff that I was learning up to the point of realization. And then it was, okay, now how is this helping me navigate this new life that I'm now living? And it, I really feel like this has been 13 years. I'm just turned 64 now. And so it's been 13 years of transition. And in that 13 years, I didn't feel really until I had fully transitioned until just recently, just a couple of months ago, literally. And so part of that, so it wasn't just like, oh yeah, I made a decision and I'm going to make, a change in my life. There was an incredible amount of time. And a lot of that was around self-acceptance, coming to understand who I was and who I wanted to be in that new person that I was. What did I want to leave behind? What did I want to take with me? And what did I want to create new? So that transitional piece was very, very, this is like a story narrative. You have the rising action, and then you have the moment, and then you have the, okay, now what? And it just kept going over and over again in those years. So it's been a wild ride. It was a wild ride before, and it got to be a wild ride after too. So yeah, it's been a journey. So are there any specific stories you'd like to hear? Because there's lots of them.
Well, I was certainly, I knew you during that time of realization. I knew you before that. A lot of the work we had done together prior to your realization that you were transgender. And I remember, first of all, that it was just a new idea for me. And I remember just being so supportive of that realization for you and the recognition and that heart to heart knowing of, oh, you have finally found. I remember you saying, I finally discovered this is what it is. This is what I've been looking for. The other piece that was so powerful for me was that you talked about how in retrospect, you knew as a young child, except you didn't know.
Right.
And of course, there wasn't a context for it as a young child or in families. And so I guess just maybe start at that part of it too, if you want to, and then where you've been from there. Because what a journey, Micah.
It has been. In writing a book is really good for a lot of reasons. And two reasons for me. One is it gave me a reflection of myself. Let me back up. So I was listening to a podcast one time by Elizabeth Gilbert. She was interviewing, it was called, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but it was about her book, Big Magic. And it was about creativity. So she was interviewing someone who had written their memoir, but hadn't published it yet. And they were talking about why she hadn't published it. And Elizabeth said to the woman, well, so you've written it once. What are you going to do next? And she said, well, I'm going to publish it. And she says, no. The first time you write it is for yourself. The second time you write it is for everybody else. And so I went back and I looked at my book, and what had happened was I was writing it completely from a victim standpoint. It's like this person did me, this was before the transgender piece. So I was looking at all the stories of my life that I was taking this victim position in this triangle of victims, persecutor, savior. I would slip into the other places in some stories, but for the large part, I was a victim. And Like, I don't even like this character. And the character was me, which actually made me look at not just the book, but was I in my life? Was I being a victim in my life too? Was I telling people stories from that victim viewpoint, which I was, totally was. So writing the book showed me that I wasn't who I thought I was. I was coming from a different place than what my head was saying I was coming from. So I started to rewrite it. And I also the other part of that initial draft was that I was writing it from a telling point of view versus stories. It was like, this is what happened to me versus creating a picture, a scene, characters, dialogue, creating an actual story with a story arc and all that kind of stuff. So I went back and I rewrote it, and it's taken a long time to write it. Part of that is because I'm a writing coach, and it's like a carpenter that never gets their own house built.
Right.
I'm always helping other people get their books published. But I went back and rewrote it into stories, and then the transgender piece came in. And then it was a matter of, well, how do I bring these two tapestries together? Because they had been so separate throughout, even though I knew the spiritual search was always related to not knowing who I was, not having clear identity of who I was. And so, yeah, it was there were a lot of revelations in the writing of the book. And even 4 weeks ago, I had another huge revelation in reading back through it again. About a month ago, someone suggested to me, why aren't you coaching transgender people? And more importantly, why aren't you coaching parents of transgender children? Because they're the ones that are having to navigate something that children can't always describe. But having been there and having, been denied that even as a young child, back to those two stories. There's two stories in my young childhood that were dual tapestries in the book. One was the first memory that I ever had was telling my mom about the spirit voices in my head, and my parents telling me, don't talk about that because people think you're crazy. Which was, there went all the spirit guides. So I didn't listen to them for a long time because the influence that this, 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child being told not to listen to the guardian angel that they've been trying to get me to listen to. So that's one thread. And then shortly after that, the other memory I have is going to ask my parents why I didn't have the thing my brother had. I didn't even have a word for it. The penis was like, okay, you don't have that because you're a girl. And it's like, no, you're wrong. I am a boy. I know I am. This is wrong. And that was the first memory of me questioning God. Wow. So I lost both the guardian angel spirit guide voice and my, well, this is a mistake. And God doesn't make mistakes. So what is there a God? That was that young. I was questioning that. That was probably when I was about 4 or 5 years old. So those are two significant threads through my life of, okay, as I said in the book, the moment they told me not to listen to my inner voice was the moment that I started looking for my inner voice again. That was the beginning of the spiritual search, even though I had it in me already. So it was like, oh, well, it's out there then. I can't listen to this thing in here. We do this with children. Oh, it's imaginary. Not really. I mean, it was telling me, don't touch the hot plate. Don't do this, steer away from this. Or I realized now I was psychic. I was reading people's minds at a very young age. I was having dreams of things that would happen. I was doing things that I didn't know until even, a year ago that I went, wow, I was really psychic as a child. I knew things that, no wonder they were saying, oh, you're a wise old soul. It was like, okay, I thought everybody had those abilities. I thought everybody had a voice in their head that was telling them what not to touch and what to touch or what to do. So that was very early influence. And, both of those were shut down. So I didn't think about it anymore. Didn't go there. Later, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I came out as a lesbian. So there was that shift. So I had a full coming out at that time as a lesbian. And so that was another part of the journey as well. And, each one of those pieces in that, there were also stories within the stories of losing, how would I say, not losing, but not having the support to do things because I was a girl, or because I looked like I did, or because I sounded like I did, because as you know, I've always had a deep voice. I'm also a very tall person, and I've always been called sir, even pre-transition. That's always been the case. So there was the arc of the story for me was almost all of it was around self-acceptance. How do I come back to myself and not be putting it in something else, whether it was appearances, the house, the car, the whatever, or whether it was on a spiritual journey looking for something. It was always out there. And that day, when I had that realization of the being transgender, that was the first time I went, I have been looking in the wrong place this whole time. It was here already, and I knew it all along. I just wasn't, I wasn't clear about it.
So in my memory with it, I think you had said it was Chaz Bono, that when you read his book,
Yep.
that was when the clarification came in.
Yeah.
Because really, truthfully, you were in the first generations of that acceptance from the external world, and both from being lesbian and then transgender, you were like a pioneer in both areas. So the external acceptance, what a challenge and what a journey.
Yeah, definitely. And it covers all kinds of topics too, from romantic partners to friendships to, work, things that I did. Most of my life, I've been an entrepreneur, which I have an entrepreneurial spirit, but it also was a way for me to create my own life and not be put in situations where that would be a difficulty, either as a lesbian or as a transgender person. So, and I have to say, in so many ways in my life, I have been so fortunate. I have an incredibly supportive family, friends, colleagues. I'm in the coaching industry, very accepting. The shamanic community has always been very supportive and accepting. So I've been very, very fortunate. Ironically, it wasn't until I came down here and in the enlightenment, quote, enlightenment community here, that I ran into my first resistance to, or I would say anti-trans conversations, interestingly. And that is what spurred the finalization of the book. So a year ago, on my birthday, it was right before my birthday, there was a woman in the community here. I'd met her when I first moved here. And one day I invited her for lunch over to my house. There's a guy that delivers meat up here. And so we were getting the meat. So let's go barbecue some meat, come to my house for lunch. So she did. We're talking. And most of the time at some point in the conversation, it comes up that the transgender subject comes up, especially if it's like, oh, I might be interested in you romantically. When does that come up? That kind of thing. So at some point, this conversation came to that point. I'm transgender. And she said, oh, I know. And I said, oh, really? So people are telling you I'm transgender, huh? Because at that point in time, I hadn't been telling a lot of people. And I don't look transgender. I don't look, female. So people are like, what? So no, I know. In fact, I wanted to talk with you about that. And she proceeded to sit on my deck, eating my food, to tell me that I was not transgender. And I what do you mean? She said, there's no such thing as transgender. It's either you're male or you're female. It's black or white. It's binary. And I was like, well, okay, you're telling me that in my lived experience, I'm sitting here in front of you and telling you what my experience is, and you say it has no basis in fact. And she says, yes. The reason why you're transgender is because of trauma. You had trauma in your childhood, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, I had trauma. The trauma was because I wasn't allowed to be transgender. The trauma wasn't because, I mean, I had a great childhood. I had a fantastic childhood. There was no trauma in my childhood, you know? So, and then she brought up, well, God doesn't make mistakes. That was the line. But then she started going into the other things of transgenders being groomers, transgenders being recruiters of other people, and the whole agenda quote, which I'd been through as a lesbian in the political arena as a lesbian too. I'd seen this, been to this rodeo before. This is not new. So then I knew that where she's getting her messages from. So I started challenging her on that. Long story short, she was going to send me all this information about, videos that she'd seen that people are regretting, all these 50% of transgender people regret reassignments, surgeries, and all this kind of stuff. I said, where are you getting these numbers? I mean, it's just ridiculous. We agreed to disagree. She left. Eventually I had to, just block her because she kept sending me stuff that was just like, you can't even believe the stuff that she's sending me. That was my first encounter. And I was just shaking. But what it did was it catalyzed my thinking around what I wanted to say in the book, what my core message really had to be. And so then 2 or 3 days later, I'm standing in the farmer's market in town, French guy from Montreal. It was classic. It's like a movie scene. He's standing, handsome French guy smoking a cigarette. He's standing there and I'm standing beside him. I had met him a couple of days before and he's talking about the enlightenment community. And all of a sudden he says something about Trump in a positive way. And I'm not going to get politics, but I said, I questioned him on that. So then he switched into the transgender situation in Canada, not knowing I'm transgender. So he says, well, what's happening in Canada is that the National Health Service is running out of money because all of these reassignment surgeries, right? I turned to him and I said, this time I turned and I stood in front of him and I said, that is absolutely patently false. And the reason why, there's 2 reasons why. One is, first of all, if the National Health Service is running out of money, that's the budgetary problem. It's not a transgender problem. Secondly, if they're paying into that, they should have something coming out. And third, the numbers don't add up. There are just not that many transgender people in the world, much less Canada, that would be happening. Well, why are you so concerned about this? And I said, well, because I've been 2 of those alphabet soups, LGBTQ. I was a lesbian, now I'm transgender, and you don't know what you're talking about. And I bet you I'm the first transgender person you've ever talked to. And he just like shut down. He didn't know what to say. And so I said, I'm going to walk away right now because I don't want to make a scene. But when I come back, I'll answer any of your questions. When I came back, he had disappeared. So, so that was the catalyzing events that said, okay, now I know what I need to do to finish this book and to put it out, because it just I don't know, it just like exploded my brain that I had made it to 63 years at that time. And I'd never been challenged in that way until the enlightenment community up here challenged it. And so it was a huge a moment for me. All of this has always happened right around my birthday, interestingly. And so the realization itself, that happened. And then this past year was a major shift on my birthday as well. May 5th is my birthday. And so, yeah, that happened. So when you say asking me questions, it's like I've been challenged in ways that it's just astounding sometimes what people think. I mean, why would I recruit somebody to live this life? It just boggles my mind that would be somebody's belief. And to the point that they would try to talk me out of it. I had another guy here too that told a mutual friend that if he had just 1 hour with me, he could talk me out of being transgender. So they don't really have an understanding of what transgender or being transgender is. And they're getting that information through a pipeline that's completely in fear. And unfortunately, we're the targets of that fear. So that's a lot of the reasons why I'm coming out with the book, why I'm switching from writing coaching into transition coaching, and why I feel like I need to be more vocal about being transgender and what that means in the world. Because I think we offer the world an incredible opportunity to see a perspective from a wide angle of a wide spectrum of perspective. You know, I've lived as a woman for 51 years. Now I'm living as a man. That perspective is invaluable if people would allow that to be. You know, we're just trying to live our lives. It's not like we're trying to change the world. We're just trying to be who we are. And in my world, I'd like to see other people, even if they're not transgender, be who they are, truthfully be there, who they are. The authenticity part, the alignment part, and the clarity part of who you are. When that happens, everything is so much easier for everybody around you. And so it's yeah, that's my new found purpose in life.
Well, I love it, Micah, because I think that probably for a lot of people with any kind of gender identity, they encounter those topics or those questions or those comments, or really, you know, it's if I say the word, it's an attack on you as a person. And like you say, it's more widespread because I know, you know, since the topic is even shamanism, the same thing can happen because you study shamanism. You know, I definitely had that where, you know, I would get that, well, just give me an hour with you and I can get you on the real path.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah, so I love the awareness of it being all inclusive of just plain finding your true self and transitioning into true self. But I do think you have a unique expertise to be able to help people that and especially some of the youth that are going to encounter these kinds of interactions with people, their own decision making. And so, can you take this into also both with your book and how that helps people, but also how the shamanism and the energy medicine really assisted you in finding your true self, back to your spirit guides, back to your remembering from the great forgetting starting in childhood, you know? So you can share about those stories too, because we definitely have some of those in common.
Can I interject just an additional question to that question, Colleen, of was there a spiritual searching or searching that kind of before shamanism that was, like you've mentioned several times, trying to fill that void before the realization? Did you have other spiritual searching that was a part of this journey too beforehand? Because I think, you know, that is another piece that, in addition to what Colleen said, is that so many people do, because it's like, okay, what am I looking for? What am I looking for? Is it this avenue, this avenue, this avenue? And also, you know, that from a spiritual perspective as well. So sorry it's just kind of, it could be an additional part to the story that I was curious about.
That's a great question. Well, as I write in the book, I rarely looked in the right places for, you know, my spiritual search. I mean, initially when I was younger, it was drugs and alcohol. You know, it's like, okay, I can't find it within. I'm going to try all these. I was experimenting with a lot of hallucinogenic type drugs, peyote, mushrooms, you know, that kind of thing. Excuse me. So initially it was that. And then that led to an experience where I actually had a kind of, you can't overdose on mushrooms, but I had a really bad trip. But, you know, looking back again, writing my book, when I revisited that, I realized that that was actually the opening to the dimensional work that I eventually got into with shamanism. Because there was just it was an incredible trip. It was a death, rebirth. Like I would see myself die. it was an out of body experience. I was seeing myself die over and over again, but then I'd come back to life. And it was that euphoric, sad, back and forth, back and forth. So it really jolted me into what is the meaning of life and why am I here? It did also stop my drug use. Smoking weed was it, but that was I never did anything else after that until I moved to Costa Rica. No, that's the end of the story, but end of the book. But anyway, so it was that was the search initially. Then it stopped, and then it was okay. But God wasn't doing it. Jesus wasn't doing it, and that was a lot from my mom's really devout Catholic, fanatical indoctrination kind of thing. And so I'd moved away from Catholicism and Christianity. So then I went into studying Baha'i, the Kabbalah. There was a lot of different avenues. I mean, I went on a field trip with a Mormon professor one time. So we went to the Mormon church and, he gave me books and stuff. And I studied that for a little while. And it's like, no, that's not doing it for me either. And a lot of it was because there was, at that time, being a girl and then eventually a woman, it was because of their views about women, the role of women in religion. And so I'm traveled a lot of Buddhism too. I studied a lot of different religions, read a lot of different religious texts. That wasn't working for me. A lot of it was around the judgmental part of a lot of the texts. There was a lot of judgment from God. Strict God didn't seem like the right thing for me either. So all those things just weren't working for me. So there wasn't anything externally or internally that was resonating at all. Now, fast forward, when I did the transition, when I had the realization of the transition, two other major events happened the same week. So I realized I'm transgender. My business partner embezzled a ton of money from me. I found that out that day, that he was in jail and had blown all the money, 6 figures. and I was dating a woman and she broke up with me. Not because I was transgender. There were other reasons, but that added to the confusion. So that all happened in a week. So I went into a deep dive. I just went into an abyss for years. And it just kind of kept going. There was just a series of events. Because when you get into that abyss, it's hard to get out of. And then the energy level just keeps you there. Sometimes it's hard to dig out of that hole. And so for the first, I would say, 5, 6, 7 years, I was just totally in an spiritual amnesia. I don't even think I was going to Light Song events anymore. I was just shut down, totally shut down. So it's a very difficult time. In fact, the transition was what got me through it. That was the hope of the transition, the hope of, wow, what could I become? What could I change in my life that would be in alignment? That kept me going through that, because I was in severe depression and I didn't know it. And so there was several years I don't even remember. I mean, I don't have them in the book because I don't remember a lot of that time. It was so lost in, I was so lost in the, emotions of that time. Then I did a 5th vision quest. It was about 8 years after I'd done 4 in a row. And that was a shift. That pulled me out of that to a degree that I could manage my life at that point in time. And then I really did focus. I had the reassignment surgery. I had a change in name, the legalities of it. And then when Pete and Letitia called me to come down to visit here in Costa Rica, I was really literally at the depths of the depression, I would say. It was really pretty. And one of the reasons I came was because, wow, Costa Rica, sunny. I was going to go back to rainy Portland instead. And so when I got down here, the first couple of weeks I was here, I went to a birthday party and somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, would you like to put a little sparkle in your," and handed me a mushroom, the whole mushroom. It popped into my, I didn't even think about it. Because by then I'd like, okay, what's it going to hurt to do this little mushroom here at this party? And that night I had a significant dream, and that shifted everything. And I started microdosing mushrooms, and it pulled me out of the depression, changed my life. And don't do it now. I did it for about a year and a half, microdosing mushrooms, and it just put a whole new perspective in my view, so to speak. And living here in paradise, the fresh water, the fresh food, the beautiful people, it was a necessary time to be here. And it was perfect. COVID hit, and we all just were in our own little bubble here. And it never hit the mountain for 18 months. COVID didn't get here for 18 months. So we had 18 months of just life. It was great. It was awesome. And so it got me to this point. And then I was still working on the book throughout this whole time. I'd been working on the book. I would go to the river, and I'd say 95% of the book was written in nature. And so that was my saving. Nature was really what pulled me through a lot of the depression in my life. And as I wrote the book, I realized I'd been in depression for most of my life because I didn't know who I was. The identity piece was missing, and that kept me in depression. That, and I had a lot of pain from back stuff. That's another part of the story. But did that answer your question? That was a long answer to that.
No, it's good.
So,
I don't remember what your question was, Colleen. Sorry. I said it was an additional question, but then I don't remember what yours was.
Well, it's also so relevant because I think so many of us that have these natural aptitudes of spirituality and being taught to forget those abilities, when in other cultures, other times, we would have been trained. We would have been identified by the grandmothers. They would have come in, or grandfathers, and said, "Oh, I see you." And it would have been empowered. And so I think it left so many of us in our later ages. And for me, the way it has always defined itself, that I didn't know then that I know now, and that this is what started with my shamanic journey with Jan as a teacher, Jan Inglesmith, by the way, as a teacher, was the understanding that I was looking for a method of spirituality that taught me how to get to my own inner truth, rather than the outside authority telling me what to believe, and my own inner authority, not the outside authority dictating to me. And at the time, I remember, because I went through that same process of going through different religions. Baha'i was one of them, which I still love. It just wasn't that accessible to me at the time. And then trying different churches and different traditions. And like you say, the biggest thing was there was always judgment. And that was my big requirement, was I didn't want something that was the one right way or that had judgment. And ironically, it's like every sermon that I heard talked about how both Catholics were not an appropriate religion, which I was also raised Catholic, and then also how women were supposed to be submissive to men. Well, I'm out. It's like, that's just not going to work for me. And so it was the same thing, that when I met Jan, and it was random, through my hairstylist said, "Go get a soul retrieval." So I did, just to do something, to try something. And it was the first place that somebody actually taught me how to find me. And, the famous story of asking a question, and Jan would always say, "Well, journey on it." And even though we felt frustrated by that, now we can look at it, and that's the answer to find your own inner truth. I'm not telling you your truth. Find your truth, find your authority. What's true for you? So anyway, that's, just relatable to how you also went on that same path from different perspectives. And for me, it was just trying to find some form of spirituality that allowed me to communicate with animals the way I always had, allowed me to have that expanded perspective of our reality, that I always had and had forgotten. And that inner voice tapping, where is it? It's right here. Find it. Go find it. Go find it. Go find it. So anyway, if you want to go ahead and segue off of that into your experience and how shamanism brought you through it, and energy medicines, energy healing, how it led you through it all.
That's exact. I mean, you could just take that word for word. That's exactly what happened. It was, wow, shamanism it's all about nature. I used to communicate with the animals. I would sit out in the cow herd talking with the cows telepathically, that different things that were, just so woven into the shamanic world for me by the time that I discovered it. I knew the first 5 minutes of the first class. And even just getting to the class, I tell the story in the book. I had a severe car accident. I came back to Portland after living in Santa Fe. And I was in a dog park, and I'd gotten friends with a dog walker, and she heard about my accident, heard about my pain in my body. And she said, well, you should go see this woman that I know. Her name is Jan Ingle Smith. So I put her number on my refrigerator. I didn't have the money. I just moved, so I was going to wait for the time. And months went by, and I would walk by the refrigerator every day and see that number. It's like, I got to call this woman. And so finally, one day I'm walking by and I find the thing, and I call her, and she says, well, I only give this class once a year, and it's starting in 2 hours. Can you come to Gresham tonight for this class? And I, like you said, that when something is calling you to do something, even though I hadn't been trained in it, it was like, this is calling me, I need to go. And so when I walked in, and here was this room of people that just immediately connected with, and the message and the telepathic, and you'll read in the book that whole thing was, I had in a dream before. I have these dreams, and they are prophetic dreams. And so I had these prophetic dreams leading me to this telepathic group of people. And so it was like immediate connection. And then talking about the nature and the connection with the animals and the, things that I had been doing all my life already, it was just such seamless that it just was a no-brainer. It's like, okay, yeah. And it was in that first class that I had my first energy healing experience, what we would call Reiki, but at that time I hadn't studied Reiki. And I had a closing to it just a couple of weeks ago, so there's a story to this. So we would chant into our hands a Celtic chant, because Jan teaches not just Native American, she teaches Celtic and Egyptian, South American, Tibetan, all kinds of shamanism. And so she had us do a chant into our hands. We were singing into our hands, chant, then we'd lay our hands on somebody else's face and do a journey for them. And so I did that, and I can't remember the woman's name, but afterwards told her the journey, and she said, do you know what happened to me? Is when you put your hands on my face, I had like a sinus headache or sinus infection when I came here, and I couldn't breathe, and I wasn't going to come tonight. Miserable. You put your hands on it, and a flash of white, and everything's gone. I can breathe now. The headache's gone. Everything's gone. And I'm like, I did that, right? Somebody had prophesied this a couple years before this, but it's like I'd never had that experience. So a week later, I go down to my cousins in California to visit for a wedding, and they have a thoroughbred ranch, and the mares were foaling. One of them was struggling. So my cousin said, hey, you come and help me. You've helped your dad before on the farm. Come and help. None of the other girls at the time that were there, he never said anything to them. He just called me. So did it, went there. The horse was struggling. It was a breech birth. Colt finally popped out, but they were both like out, bleeding out. The mare was bleeding out. The colt was dying, wasn't breathing, all that kind of stuff. My cousin went to get his phone, and I said, what the heck? I'll do this chant again. And I had them both up on their feet by the time he got back with the phone. And so so then I had this ability. So then I studied Reiki up to level 2, but I would use this again, but I forgot the chant part. So I've been doing this healing stuff for years, and it had marginal effect. Well, a month ago, literally, I'm sitting at the river, and I'm singing. I'm singing and singing, and I have this literally like this visit from, it was one of those transcendental moments where I was surrounded. It was a dark and cloudy day, but the light surrounded me. I could see the stars in the night sky, and all this channeled information just came down. And one of the things it said was, you've been forgetting the chant. So you need to sing when you're healing. It's the singing was what I'm channeling. Duh. So that's another part of the story of the book, is the loss of my singing voice over the years. So, and regaining it. So, yeah, so that happened just a month ago, and it brought all those threads back again to, oh, wow, I can do this healing better when I'm actually chanting and channeling that way. So it was a big aha moment. So there's a lot of different, that's the thing that Jan taught us. You can do a journey, and it might not be till years later that you get the understanding of that journey, or it finally wraps around and ties a bow on what it was that you were meant to learn or meant to do. So that all happened, and it keeps happening. That's the thing; it just never stops. All the stories. So,
well, and speaking of vision quests and it taking years to come around, and my very first quest, and it was out on Too Tired Farm and super hot and all of the things, and they're, for anyone listening, they sound romantic, but they're hard. Right. And the one and I had the only visit I had from any nature was a caterpillar. And this caterpillar stayed with me through the whole quest. And he had little fern-like antenna. And so when we came down off the hill and other people had seen bears and cougars and elk, and I was like, I got a caterpillar. Discovering years later, it was teaching me about the fairy realms. And then when I did my very first regalia, it was all about those antennae from that caterpillar teaching me about Iris, my fairy grandmother, and accessing the fairy realms and the channeling of her and as a being. So just like you say, it can be years later that you finally go, oh, that's what that was.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Actually, I had the first vision quest that we did in Redmond on Terry's land at one time before we moved out to the Tillamook.
Oh, right.
I got bit by a scorpion the first
night.
Oh,
that's right.
Yeah. Got bit twice actually by a scorpion. I didn't know it. I thought it was an ant in my sleeping bag. But Jan said afterwards, she said, yeah, that scorpion is a sign of transition, of transformation. So be prepared. Like, okay. Well, it wasn't until much later. I mean, it was 10 years, 11 years later, but it was, and I would say that whole thing was about transformation. The whole 10 years, I've had the realization.
Well, he froze there for a minute. So while we're waiting for his internet to unfreeze, I do have to also share a story about that particular vision quest, because it was hot and it was hard. And Micah was actually one of the questers. I was in the camp leadership doing teachings and things like that. And one of the really funny parts of that was that, unbeknownst to us, that land was being sold. It was a couple 100 acres and it was being sold. And I'm sure Michael will come right back on. It was being sold. And so there were developers that were flying up from California, and they were in a helicopter flying over the land, trying to, of course, inspect the land. And there all of us are out there doing the different vision quests. We're all dancing, doing our stuff. And Micah had been bit by the scorpion, and he was in a total dream state and thought that the helicopter was a dragonfly. And so he's speaking to the dragonfly And so anyway,
From like the poison?
from the poison,
Wow.
the and you know, just so everybody knows, we check on people, so it is safe. He was safe. You know, so we do check on them at least once a day, and in a case like that, but he was safe and he was fine, and it was part of his journey. But that was, some of those were very difficult lands that we were on. This was over by Bend in Redmond, Oregon, and very hot, very dry, but beautiful, and quite an amazing experience too.
All right. So Micah lost internet for a minute, and now he is back. And so he's going to actually talk about his perspective about the scorpion story that Colleen just talked about. Go ahead, Micah.
Well, let me preface this. I thought it was ants because there were two ant hills on each side of the space, the Hochika space that I was in.
Sounds
so I thought,
like a dream.
yeah. So I had made a deal because Jan had talked about ants at the opening ceremony. It was like, pay attention to the ants. They have messages for you. So I had made an agreement with the ants that they couldn't be in my sleeping bag. They could be around my sleeping bag because we could have sleeping bags because it was a practicum. And so, so when I got bit that first night, I was like, dang, those ants didn't pay attention to me. I didn't have a connection with them. But anyway, so I went to sleep. It was dark. I couldn't do anything. I didn't have any medicine with me anyway. So went to sleep. And the next morning I woke up just so sick, just horribly sick. I couldn't do anything. But the one thing that I could do was sit there and think of all the delicious food that I would be eating if I wasn't sitting on this, you know, on the hill doing this vision quest. And what was I thinking, paying, you know, $500 to go out here and starve myself in the desert, you know, that all those things go through your mind. You know, it's just like over and over, the hamburgers and you know, pizzas and, you know, what, everything. So, and then I recover from that, you know, well, it's a telepathic practicum. And so what was, Jan came that morning when I was really sick. She came with some broth and a little bit of water for me. So that pulled me out of it. And by the end of that day, I was fine. But then the very last night, I got bit again. Because, you know, by the second day of a vision quest, you don't have any energy. And I didn't think let's shake the ants out of the sleeping bag. I didn't do that. So I was sleeping with a scorpion for 4 nights. So the last night I got bit again. Now then I had some homeopathic medicine, took that, and I wasn't so bad the next morning. But when I was shaking out to pack the next morning was when the scorpion came out. And that's when I knew I'd been sleeping with a scorpion. But it was about transformation and you know, the time between that vision quest and the next 3 years, I did 3 more. So I did 4 in a row vision quests for the 4 directions of the medicine wheel. And a lot of that was because I was looking for that identity. I was looking for that, you know, again, this is going to help me find something that was creating such a void in me that I was looking for it somewhere else. But those were invaluable. And I, you know, that the stories are all in the book, but each one had a theme to it, and each one had a specific learning. Each one had animals that showed up in different ways. I had a bear show up in the third one when we were out there. So it was very, and then the very last one was more like a rite of passage. That was after I had been through much of the transition, and it was much more a launching pad. But that was when I went into the fairy realm, was in that particular one. I slept for a long, long time, and it felt like a fairy tale dream, like I had been rewired when I came out of that. So it was a lot different than the first 4. The first 4 were more seeking. The last one was more, okay, stepping into something new, that rite of passage.
Micah, you'll be moving, or you are already, or into transition coaching, as you said. What are some of maybe the things tools or techniques that you might share with the transgender community that either were helpful for you, or that now in retrospect you were like, oh, this would be really helpful? I know, you know, vision quest might not be either available or, of interest to all people. And so I'm just curious as to some of those, moving a little bit of the conversation also into some of those kinds of things that maybe your wisdom can be passed on as well. Or like you said, maybe into the cis community that might be supporting people that are in this process, whether that's children or friends or other family members.
I really wish I had had a coach.
Yeah.
There are more out there right now, but it wasn't anything like that when I first started to transition that I knew of. I hadn't heard anything. I did join a support group in Portland. There were resources in Portland. That isn't always true for everybody. So that's an unfortunate thing. I think what really saved me was writing about it. The writing, not just for the book, but the journaling, the processing, the going into my own thoughts and my own emotions around what I was experiencing at any given time. What was it like to think about taking testosterone? What was it like to navigate that? How do you start doing that? Fortunately, I also, my partner for 10 years in my 20s, her name is Leslie Nicholas, Dr. Leslie in the book. She became a naturopath because of something that was going on with me with headaches. And then later, much later, we remained friends for years, still are. So when I had the realization, I said, "Oh, I'm going to tell her about this because she's in the lesbian community and LGBT community. She's going to understand this, etc." So I tell her, and it turns out she specializes in hormones for transgender people. I didn't know this, and all the time that I knew she'd helped me through menopause with hormones, but I didn't know that she was specializing for transgender people. And so she's like, "You don't need to do anything. You're already passing. Why do any of those things? You can do that. People already think you're sir, etc." Well, I wanted to explore that because I had this realization. Do I just sit here with it? No, I wanted to do something with it. And so we started with lotion for testosterone. That wasn't working for me in the way that I wanted it to. So then we did injections. So things like that I had help because of her. But if she hadn't been in my life, that would have been an unknown, even finding a doctor that would be working with testosterone, etc. Again, in Portland, the resources are different, but in other parts of the country, you may not be able to do that. So there's a lot of steps along the way that I wish I had more support of, but you learn to navigate it even though you don't have the support. And we're very lucky right now to have the internet to access information.
That's what
I spent so many hours the first few weeks of the transition after the realization, just like the scope of it was bigger than I realized. The industry, the finding resources, etc. It was just starting to pick up then, but now, there's a lot of difference now. But for me, the writing was so essential. It just really helped me reflect on where I was with things. I imagine if I went back and looked at all those manuals or journals right now, it would be probably overwhelming to read at times, I would think. But it did get me through a lot of dark places, for sure. Definitely. And again, the resources now are so different than they were 10, 15 years, 13 years ago.
I was going to ask, are there, for people that don't live in areas where even a support group might be helpful, there's probably support groups that are online that meet on Zoom, things like that as well now?
And I don't have it built yet. This is really new, this whole I'm transitioning to become a transition coach. But I will have a resource page on my website for things like that, support groups, different even different industries that are focused on the transgender experience. Clothes,
I was going to say, what do you mean by that?
Things that are, like compression shirts before I had the reassignment surgery. Didn't know anything about them. I just stumbled on a website and I was like, oh, that's a good idea. There was a lot of hunt and peck and see what worked for me, what I could afford at the time or whatever it was. Now, I was also lucky that I had the year that it happened, that the year that I decided to do the reassignment surgery, Obamacare was available. And I was able to get Obamacare, and it was actually Affordable Care Act, and it was actually paid for. I'd had, excuse me, I'd had back surgery when I was 20, and so I had pre-existing conditions, so I didn't have insurance because of the cost of insurance for most of my adult life. And so it was a blessing. So the timing of things was also very good for me in terms of my own transition, that it wasn't for a lot of people. I've been very fortunate.
As a transition coach, are you going to be bringing in any of these energy medicines as part of what you teach for people, how to get to their authentic self and authentic authority?
What a great idea.
I know, as I was saying it, I was like, okay, we need to help with some Reiki with it too, so that because Reiki is certainly a much easier modality to learn, and I'm not trying to change that, but with you being online, probably for most of your transitioning coaching. So we'll talk about that afterwards.
Okay.
To help you get that part so that you can help people with Reiki as well.
I think, that would be great. That's awesome. And it is a great idea. And I have to say, and this is true of the transition, the transgender transition and my current transition in my business. And that is that once you get clear, like the clarity is there. And I want to explain where the clarity came in recently, is I've been a writing coach for 30 years, but I've been burnt out on it for a long time. And so I'd been looking for, okay, what's the next step? What's the next step in it? And a lot of it was around, I know there's a divine purpose that I'm meant to live in this lifetime, but it hasn't seemed to shown up yet. And I thought the transgender piece was. And so it was like, well, that's not true either, because I'm still in that state in my business that I'm still unsure of what my next step is, where the path of destiny is going to take me. And then about a month ago was when this all came up. Wow, you should be a transition coach. And so just like at the beginning, it was like, okay, that's a great idea. I'm clear. This is where I want to go. Now what? It's like the dog that catches the bus. What do you do now? Okay. So then it becomes a learning experience. Oh, okay. I have an idea. I'm gonna weave together the course of storytelling about your transition. So bring the writing into the transition process. That's one thing. So energy work, great idea. Oh, shamanic work. So now all the ideas start to mushroom, and like, okay, what is it that I really am bringing to the transition coaching? Now, coaching, that I have down. Like, tell me where you want to go. Tell me what's blocking you. Let's see how we can move through those things. Let's get to that point. Anything else, the tools that come in will be, right now, I'm literally just exploring those possibilities. So yeah, any ideas you have, I'm open to them.
Oh, they're already popping.
I know. I was like, guided journeys with automatic writing.
Oh, see?
Exactly.
Yes. Awesome.
Well, ironically, Micah, we teach a course called Next Step Reiki.
See?
Discover your next step. And so, and it's all about how to journey with Reiki, and we use automatic writing.
Awesome. Okay, we'll be talking.
Yes,
the additional healing and the not, one of the things that you were talking about, and one of the things why so many people are drawn to this type of spirituality is it's non-dogmatic. I mean, not everywhere, but it's generally non-dogmatic. And what a huge, you even said it in the things, that intersectionality of belonging, and not that somebody has to be into spirituality to have a transition coach, but for those that are searching for that as well, what a beautiful sense of belonging from so many different aspects, and healing from so many different aspects that are like right here, in this one idea that is so needed too.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's, it kind of wraps around to the end of the book because, throughout my life, I'd resisted God and Jesus and Christianity and, didn't have that whole search. But ultimately, it was shamanism and quantum physics and the whole dimensionality again that brought me back to understanding what God is. And that was stumbling into grace. So, the last chapter is this dream that I had when I was on mushrooms when I first got here of, having a conversation with these ascended masters who were my parents and my relatives. They were the same. It was like I was in this dream having this conversation about the fact that we are God within, and that the acceptance of that God within and that embracing of the God within is what allows us to see the God in others, because that is us in every lifetime, in every life time, what do you call it, timeline, in every lifetime, in every dimension. We are all of it.
Yeah.
I had an experience, it didn't get in the book, and maybe I should change that, but there's so many stories I had to take out of the book. But one of them was when I went to a writing retreat I was teaching in Scotland. It was on the Isle of Iona, which is a very sacred island. It's the birthplace of the Church of Scotland. And there's an abbey there, and there's a lot of pilgrimages to the abbey. It's not an easy place to get to. Gorgeous island, very mystical. So I teach my writing course, and there's a woman and I, two women and I decided to go down to the local pub and have lunch. So we're sitting there. She's reading this brochure, and we look out, and there's this cove there. And she says, I really want to go see that cove. Let's go to the cove. Let's go to the cove. So we go out, and we're standing by the cove, and I walk up, and this is before I started studying shamanism, or maybe it was right after. It was very early in the studies. But I walked through a timeline, and all of a sudden I was in this massacre of these monks. And I was seeing the blood in the water. I was seeing the sheep I was in it. I was literally in it, being one of the murderers, interestingly. And I had this like a warp feeling of like, is this real? What, I could tell I was still conscious in the quote real world, that it just like got sucked into this thing. Well, the woman that she saw me, like, she must have seen me go white or something, but she kind of grabbed me and kind of pulled me out of it. And I was like, well, that happened. So I go back to the house where we had been giving my cat's walking. So if you see a tail come down, it's my cat. So I go back to the house we're staying in, and the woman that had helped me arrange this whole writing retreat was sitting there, and she did reading. She did it with pendulums. She was just sitting there with her pendulum at the table. And I walk in, and she said, you went through a timeline, didn't you? And I'm like, okay. She said, I was just doing a reading, and you've done 18 lifetimes on this island. And I'm like, okay, so many things went through my head at that time. Because again, I hadn't been studying shamanism for very long, if at all. I can't remember the year it was, but and so she said, yeah, so let's clear that energy. Let's do this. And that was my first time that I went, wait a sec. Because she said, you were the sheep on the hill, you were the monks getting killed, you were the Viking person, you were all of these parts. And I remembered having a journey during one of our classes in shamanism about where I had seen the crucifixion of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And in the journey, the same thing. I was Jesus on the cross. I was the Roman soldiers. I was Mary. I was all of these things. And the same message came through was, you are all of these things, because in the ascension process, you are experiencing all of these things from all the different dimensions, all the different perspectives, so that you can see where it is that you need to shift and transform in order to ascend. To become that higher frequency being, you have to have all of these experiences. So that had been in a previous journey, and then it was this experience in Scotland that I had. And that's when I really dove into, okay, I really want to figure out what's going on here. Whether it was the quantum physics of it, the timeline of it. And a lot of it, even throughout my time in Light Song, I had a skeptical mind. So when we would do the Lawampi ceremony, and things would happen in these ceremonies, and you just
Totally.
couldn't explain it, and you're just like, well, how can? It was like Jan always says, it's not I'll believe it when I see it. It's I'll see it when I believe it. And it took me a while to get there, but all of these experiences, and when I tell people outside of people that have had similar experiences or understand the possibilities of it, they look at me like I am crazy.
Yes.
It's like, how can you have had these experiences? It's like, I don't know how to tell you this, but I have. I had a reader when I sent the book out this past year to several readers. Jan was one of them. And one of the readers, I knew he was going to come back with some really interesting stuff. He said, I'm really a skeptic. He said, I only read this book because I know you. But did these things really happen? I mean, did you really have these dreams? Did you really have these, experiences? And it's like, yeah, I did. He just couldn't believe it. So I ended up having to go back and write some stories into the book to kind of explain my own movement from skepticism to belief in a lot of these things that were happening that are unexplainable to the quote rational mind.
It's funny, Micah, with you being a writer and coach and all of that, with writing, Colleen always says, I literally couldn't make these things up. If I could, I'd be a world famous novelist.
Thought about it.
It's like, there was a time come from.
Exactly. There was a time I actually thought, well, maybe I should just write this as a fiction.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I went down that road.
Yeah.
For sure.
But I also support being skeptical, because I look at all of this and I think it is so outside of the box. And at the same time, I have to say that there's the inner knowing of it that keeps driving the wanting to have the experience again and having the remembering. But some of those early experiences of the first time, I remember in one of the sweat lodges, and the first time I actually physically saw a spirit, because I have the knowing of them, but I don't usually physically see them. And so the whole time I'm like, okay, if you're real, move to the left, and it would move. Okay, no, seriously, if you're real, now move to the right, and it would move. And I spent the whole sweat lodge doing that. And I think it was even Paul or Phil Crazybull that was pouring the lodge. Must have been Phil, and pouring the lodge. And I spent the whole lodge questioning this spirit, and it kept doing exactly. I mean, it would go exactly. And then afterwards thought, why did I spend my whole time on that? Except now, again, in reflection, I look at what it actually taught me. And to go through the skepticism, honor the skepticism, honor the validation and the need for it, because so many people going through this, as for us as teachers, to really allow them that skepticism. And you can still believe it and see it, and still hold that little bit of like, okay, really? And sometimes I'm shocked at, well, I guess I don't think I have the same level of skepticism that I used to have, but I still am kind of amazed at just how amazing it is, how fantastical the journeys can be, and the information that comes in, and what we see and experience. And so then I think, well, is that a level of skepticism? Because after 20 some odd years, you'd think I would be a little bit more like, oh yeah, that just happened and that's normal. But I'm still in that place of just awe. Look what we get to know.
Yep, totally. Yeah, it is awe. That's a good word for it. That whole unexplainable. I remember when I first started studying with Jan was, gosh, I know all this stuff. I could teach this stuff. You have that bravado, that ego thing going on of
Right.
this is all stuff that I know. And then as I learned more, I realized how, the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know.
Yes.
The more I realized, wow, I have so much to learn. And I've been that way all my life. I've been a learner. I mean, I am curious. I am wanting to expand. I think my first clue actually was my first journey when we went to get our power animal. It was my first clue, but it didn't change my skeptical mind. But it was because, I'm going to do this journey. And in my mind, it was, it's going to be a buffalo or an eagle or something, grand, a lion, something big, grand. And it was a snake. And I do not like snakes at all. Don't like to touch them. Don't like to see them. They frighten me. Not a snake person, probably from the Bible and the whole serpent thing. But it just like, why would a snake be showing up in my, as my power animal? And then the next question we were supposed to ask in the journey was, what are your gifts for us? What are your gifts for me? And it said, well, number one, face your fears. This is facing your fears. You fear me, well, face it. I'm your power guide. I'm your power animal. And the other one was, you're all about evolution. Your life will be about transformation. It said that very first journey. Your life is about evolution. It's about change and the shedding of the skin and the rebirth. It's going to be what your journey is going to be about, what your life is going to be about. And at the time, you write it down again. You go, okay, yeah, maybe sometime down the line, this might have some meaning, but it didn't at the time. It did to it. I mean, the inner knowing was, yeah, you're right. I am into evolving. I am into transformation. And that has happened a lot in my life. But at the same time, it was, I don't like snakes. But in my skeptical mind was, well, how did that snake show up? Because I didn't create that snake. It wasn't me coming up with a snake. I wouldn't have done that. That it was a subconscious thing or a spirit thing, either way. So that was my first clue, but I didn't pay attention to it till later on.
Well, and the fun part is that it's unlimited. And now at this stage, I'm no longer at the place of I want to get there. It's like now I'm so excited that there is no getting there. There's the unlimited journey of it all.
Exactly. And truly, the purpose is the journey.
Yes.
Because throughout my life, there's been so many transformations. I mean, yes, there's a big one. But, even who I was in my 30s was changed by my 50s. I had already transitioned several times in my life before I got to the transition. Now, this transition was physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, which you don't usually get in life. Usually you have maybe a relationship transition or a work transition or, that kind of thing. But we all transition all of our lives. And I'm putting myself out as a transition coach for transgender people, but my experiences in transitions are not limited to being transgender. Yeah. I mean, they're basically the same process. You're going to be going through sometimes clarity, sometimes fear, sometimes a lot of times grief for the things that you're losing, and then excitement. You have all of these emotional. I think that's another thing that shamanism really helped me with was becoming, having a thermostat for the emotions. Like it wasn't like before I was up and down where, okay, when I'm in the moment, which is another thing I learned from shamanism, is really being present and in the moment. Nature does that. When you're with nature, they don't remember things. Something happens, they just keep going. And so being in the moment and being in that place of being able to be grounded enough to find the answer, of being able to navigate the emotions in a way that aren't so leaving you as a victim or, putting you in that victim triangle type of a thing. So there's all of those things are parts of every transition. You're going to have the loss. You're going to have the grief. That was a big reason why I stayed in the depression for so long, because I was losing not just the sisterhood, I was losing lesbian community, and I was losing friends, because when you come into alignment with yourself and you're in that authentic state and you're being who you are for the first time, you have to realize that all the people prior to that, not all of them, but most of the people prior to that, are your energetic match when you're unaligned.
Mm.
So they're now seeing me aligned, and they can't see me in them anymore, because it's uncomfortable if they're not aligned in their own truth. And so it becomes a friction, actually, to be around somebody that when they're in alignment and you aren't. I know that from my experience as well, of being unaligned, and then I'm around somebody that's really aligned, and it's like, it doesn't feel comfortable because I want to be that and I'm not. So you have that aspect of things. And then there's the, depending on what it is, if it's a location change or a relation change, there are a lot of physical changes as well. You are also can go through that. So transition there's of course transgender thing. You're also then layers of politics and layers of acceptance that are probably a lot more than most transitions in people's lives. But the basics of transition are the same, no matter what transition.
Well, and like you say, the multi-layers of it.
Yep.
Relationships, but you're right, it is transition all the way around.
Mm-hmm.
And
many times.
Yeah. Although I think there's probably that next level with gender identity, because of the finding that inner truth at a level where, and I only know what I think, so let me preface it with that, but really getting to know yourself at that level and truly settling in with who you are has to be a whole other level of self-discovery, self-awareness, inner acceptance. And then, like you say, from the external world to the internal world, managing all of it.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and it's just happened recently again, when I had this revelation about being a transition coach, and that is that when that level of clarity happens, and describe this in the book, when I had that realization of being transgender, is like the colors changed. Like there was a knowingness that was so deep, like you knew that there was no question. I knew there was no question that I needed to respond and take action on this. It just, everything shifted. And I had this recently again with the transition coaching, was like, oh, it just all became clear. The channels opened, things started downloading. There was this, everything shifted. I mean, financial stuff shifted, acceptance shifted, resources shifted. Things are coming in now. The universe is like, yes, you're on your right path now. Now, ironically, you would think, oh, well, I've been transitioning for 13 years. You'd think that I'd figured this out before. But sometimes you're not supposed to figure it out. Sometimes you need the opening chapter of my book, the prologue in my book, was a dream I had when I was in high school of being in this stadium. We didn't know why we were there. And I was asking everybody, why are we here? Why are we here? And then finally toward the end of the dream, I'm like, because the spirit guide had told me at the beginning of this scene, you'll know when you need to know, and you'll need to know when you know. It was this riddle. I just kept saying this in the dream. You'll know when and I kept saying, well, why can't you just tell me now if I'm going to find out anyway? And then it disappeared, went down into the stadium. I'm asking all the people, why are we here? And then finally I get it. It's like, we don't need to ask somebody else. It's not outside of us. And then I wake up from the dream. This is in high school. So now coming back around much later, it's like, oh, we need to know when we need to know. We already know it. It surfaces when we need to know. But that inner knowing is guiding us the whole time. It's like I say in the book, it's like we have this invisible map of destiny, and we take a choice, and the choice determines the fate of that path. We might take a right turn, and then we might take a left turn, but ultimately we still get to the destiny we were meant to make. You know, we had a journey of this one time in Jan's class, journey to see if you had taken that other route at that fork in the road, where would you be now? And it was always back to where we were. The journey's always brought us back to where we were, no matter what route we took. So if you have this, so now I'm seeing this transgender piece, who I am as a transgender person, that was my destiny. I fought it the whole time. There was resistance to it. There was a lot of, denial of it, even after the transition of who I am. But because that is my destiny, it was always going to lead me to this decision. And I always knew that. It was getting out of my own way to get to that point that made a difference. And then when it all of a sudden, all those threads came together, both then and just a month ago, it's like, that feeling is just so different than anything you can experience. It's really quite amazing when you get to that point. Now, some people have that early in life, and so they aren't looking for that their entire lives. But in my case, it was, my own resistances that got in my way. The resistance to stepping into the bigness of who I am.
Absolutely. And like you say, it's a journey so many of us go through into the remembering of what we know.
What we know.
Yeah.
It's all there. It's just the uncovering. And I think the people that are fearful of transgender people are just generally fearful people.
Yeah.
When you don't know, when you're not aligned yourself and you see somebody that's living their truth, even though it's uncomfortable to see for some people, that makes people fearful. And sometimes resentful, and sometimes very angry, because that isn't in their life. And they don't even know it sometimes. Subconsciously, they don't know it. I mean, they don't know it consciously, they know it subconsciously. But it goes back to that when I lost so many friends, it was like they couldn't see themselves in me anymore. It wasn't in alignment with their current truth. And so I feel my role now is to help people see not only the God in themselves, but the God in other people. No matter what they say or do to you, they still are you. And so if people can see that and say, okay, wow, we're all one, truly one. We all have these different, ways of being that one. But is it wrong? Or is it just who we are? And the fear is what makes it wrong. And I'm a pretty good person. You don't really have a lot to fear from me, so it's like, but, when people know that I'm transgender, then it becomes something different. And why? If you knew me for 2 years before and then found out I was transgender, how does that change your perception of me? If there's a change in perception, it's not me, it's you. And so how do we find a way to see me different because I am you, that kind of thing. And it's such a mind bender sometimes when you're thinking in the dimensionality piece of it, that it's hard to imagine that you're all of the things in your life at one time.
Well, I think it's the duality of the earth. And, when we're in the enlightened realms and the non-dual realms, then we can see that. And then arriving here where there's so much duality, and then free will in choosing about our perceptions of the duality and where we are going to be with that. It's such a journey for every single human being. And one of the things we say all the time is, I think there are now 8 billion people on the planet and 8 billion realities. And that's just human beings. Everything else has a reality. Those ants.
I was going to say the ants.
The ants.
And the scorpion. How did I get in here?
Like, where am I?
That's so true.
What happened?
Yeah, my dogs all right when you were talking about the animals, they all started to bark all at once. They were all a chorus of dogs around here.
Saying hi. We have
Nice to
our
hear that.
reality too.
We're-
Hi.
Remember us.
Speaking of talking to the animals, I never even knew people didn't talk to the animals until I heard there was an animal communication class. I was like, oh, I better take that. And it did deepen my knowledge of it. But I just thought everybody talked to the animals.
Yeah,
So
me too. There's so
yeah.
many things that I just assumed everybody did
Yeah,
for,
that is,
for a long
that's
time.
just
Yeah,
how
no,
it works. Of course, the trees will talk to you.
the empathy part too, empathic, is like I would be able to, sense when somebody walked into a room what they were feeling at a very young age, which is great knowledge to have because then you know how to navigate if you are paying attention to things. But yeah, I didn't realize that until I was studying with Betsy
Bergstrom.
Bergstrom. And she said, "Oh, well, yeah, you're an empath. No wonder." It was like, I am. Oh yeah, I guess I am. That kind of thing. It's what you don't know what you don't know. So I
Well,
feel like
Micah,
sometimes
oh,
right
go
now,
ahead.
right now I feel like I'm a kid again. Like that's what it feels like. Like when I had the realization, the same thing. I was like, wow. In the rush of it, it's exciting. Then you got to do the work, but the rush of it is like, wow, the potential is the possibilities are endless of how this can go. And the same with the transition coaching. Yeah, so it's all fun.
Well, I am so excited for you and just touches my heart to be back in touch with you. We haven't talked for a little while. And like I say, we've been on this journey together for over 20 years. And it's just so good to hear your story. And yes, we definitely need to talk more. And I'm so excited about the work you can do to both for yourself, but also for all those people that you can reach and help through their own transitions and writing, because you still do that too.
Yep, still do that.
Well, and also I just wanted to make sure we're mentioning the title of his book again. It's Stumbling into Grace, The Adventures of a Transgender Shaman. And you can find everything for Micah at micahschwader.com. Your book's also on Amazon, correct, Micah?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Well, unofficially it is, but it's not in its final form yet.
Okay.
I'm working on, I literally finished, I have one more chapter to write to add that somebody suggested around romance as a transgender person. So I'm writing that. And then I'm going to do the audiobook. So I'm hoping to have all that done by the time this is aired in June. So,
well, if not, is it in pre-order or there's just an awareness that that's where you can find it when it's
it will be on.
Okay.
It'll be on all channels, retail and Amazon. Yeah, everywhere.
And
ebook.
like Powell's local bookshops, things like that, or they can always order it
Right.
as well.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, keep an eye out at Micah Schwader, and Schwader is SCHWADER. So micahschwader.com. And of course, we'll have this in the description as well.
This has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Micah.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Wow, great. So fun. So good to just be in touch.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
All right. And thank you. Thank you to all of our listeners. We just, of course, appreciate all of you as well. And we will catch up with you all next time. All right. Bye.